Hello, friends. My name is John Burness, and I am a musician and self-described soundwriter, which just means that I use a wide array of audio sounds audio mediums that excludes music to tell stories. And I am going to do another edition of my History of Poetry lecture series, which I love doing. And I haven't done it in a few months, and I think this is going to be really good for me to start doing this more often as learning how to master poetry for the past 5 years. I feel it would be of use to the world to share with a wide array of people, via the internet, what I've learned throughout the years. Because I've learned a lot of stuff that not a lot of people know about, and I just really want to share it with people using a very accessible format. And I really want to hone in my academic skills and build up experience teaching, as professionally this might be of interest in the future. So today we're going to talk all about a movement, more or less, in the 60s from America called deep image poetry. I am very excited to teach this with you all because in my mind this is as good as American poetry got. It only lasted for a few years in the 1960s with only a few pretty obscure poets, and it is some of the best American poetry I have ever seen, and I've never really seen anything as moving and as touching as the deep image poems before or since. So I'm going to share with you hopefully all there is to know about it using the resources I've found. And I am hoping by the end of this lecture that whoever watching will have a reasonable understanding of deep image poetry. The term deep image itself was coined around 1961 by Jerome Rothenberg and Robert Kelly, two young American poets influenced by the haunting Spanish cantejando, or deep song, of Federico Garcia Lorca. They were fascinated by the idea that a poem's images could forge a direct link between the physical world and the spiritual or subconscious, what the French symbolists called correspondence. In a published note, Kelly said, nothing can be known except in context, and by placing vivid images in the right context, a poem could more or less transform the perceived world. This was heady, visionary stuff. Poetry as kind of dream logic connecting outer and inner realities. Rothenberg and Kelly originally applied deep image to describe the edgy, surreal work of poets like Diane Wakoski and even their own. Particularly Wakoski's early poems, for example, mixed intensely personal feelings with mythic and sensory imagery, creating a kind of private dreamscape on the page. Deep Image wasn't a formal school with a manifesto or membership cards like the Surrealists or Dadaists or anything else that would usually go on in France. It was more of a tendency that several poets shared. In 1964, an anthology even lumped some of them together, confirming that something like a movement was afoot. The concept truly caught fire when Robert Bly, a charismatic Minnesota poet, adopted and championed it in the mid 60s. Bly, along with friends like James Wright and Galway Kinnell, felt American poetry had gotten too tight and tame. Through the 50s, through a little magazine he co founded, cheekily named after the decade, Bly urged poets to break free of academic formalism. He was rebelling against what was the dominant mode in poetry, the buttoned up new criticism and its carefully crafted, detached verse. Instead, Bly and his circle wanted poems that were free, personal, and filled with visceral imagery, poems that leapt into the unknown reaches of the psyche. In contrast to the confessional poets of the time, think like Sylvia Plath or Robert Lowell, bearing their souls very directly, the deep image poets sought a more symbolic, transcendent kind of personal expression. They drew inspiration from foreign voices, like many great American poets, Lorca, Pablo Neruda, Cesar Vallejo, whose surreal, image-laden poems showed that leaping imagination could convey emotion more powerfully than plain confession, which was obviously very commonplace with people like Bukowski and Brodigan. Not that I don't like those poets; those are super talented poets, but these poets felt that there needed to be some sort of break from that. So by the late 1960s, you have this loose gathering of poets: Bly, Wright, Kinnell, Wachowski, Robert Kelly himself, all experimenting with what an image in a poem can do. So there's no single manifesto, there's no official meetings. It's really a shared belief, an internal belief that a poem's true magic lies in its images and the intuitive leaps between them. This ethos set the stage for the richly imagistic, half dreaming, emotionally charged poetry we're about to dig into. And I'm about to show you some excerpts. So, what makes a poem recognizably deep image? Let's break down a few defining traits. First and foremost, the image is king of the poem. These poets believed a concrete image, something you can see, smell, touch, carries far more emotional weight than abstract language. As Robert Bly and company put it, be concrete, not abstract, quote unquote, and let the images do the work. Instead of explaining an idea or an emotion, a deep image poem will present a picture or an experience and trust that the meaning will arise from it. Think of a haiku like clarity of image, but charged with mysterious significance. Another key feature is the wild leap of imagination. Deep image poems often make associative jumps that can feel surprising or dreamlike, excuse me. Bly actually preferred the term leaping poetry for this reason. He noticed that great poetry across cultures, everything from ancient myths to Spanish surrealists, often leaps from one image to another in a way that defies linear logic. Yet it strikes us as true on a gut level. This poetry doesn't move straight from A to B. It vaults from A to somewhere across a chasm, trusting the reader's intuition to follow. The effect is a little jarring and magical. As an example, poet Robert Kelly described nightfall in one of his deep image poems as coming alive with a quote unquote roar of things out of the streets, and then suddenly personified the very night as something quote unquote covered with skin, giving entrance to a living house. On a rational level, that's very odd. But of course, it does a great job at evoking the night feeling, being alive and intimate, which those two are unrelated subject matter. Like it's the point just said, many great poems from throughout history do great at that particular task, combiningly seemingly unrelated subjects. The deep imagists love that kind of intuitive leap. Importantly, these leaps and images are not random for randomness' sake. They aim to reveal the inner life of the poet or speaker. Deep image poetry merges the outer world and the inner psyche in fluid ways. We see landscapes suddenly charged with the poet's feelings, or objects that become symbols for spiritual realities. One poet said it's like the image creates a correspondence between the external world and the artist himself. So it's kind of like a very symbolic, like an artistic social work of some sort. The idea is that if you get the right image, the poem will contain the object and the subject at once. For instance, in Bly's line about scooping up quote unquote handfuls of darkness, the physical darkness of a snowy afternoon is also the speaker's internal darkness. The image bridges the two realms. This gives the poetry a kind of mythic or archetypal feeling. We sense that the images point to something deeper under the surface of everyday life. Um, Stylistically, most deep image poems are in free verse and often come across as short narratives or meditations, unlike the imagist poets of earlier decades, who gave us crystalline images, but in a very impersonal way. The deep imagists do use a personal, sometimes storytelling voice. The language tends to be plain spoken, even casually conversational, so that the reader is lured in before they realize how strange the underlying images might be. A poem might start, quote unquote, "I was lying in a ham hock at William Duffy's farm on a late afternoon." Perfectly accessible English. The poet James Wright did exactly that. He opens with calm pastoral images, a bronze butterfly, distant cowbells, sunlight on old horse droppings. The lines are simple descriptions, but then those images themselves begin to take on an almost mystical quality. He writes that the horse droppings, quote unquote, blaze up into golden stones under the sun. Suddenly, dung glows like treasure. This is how a deep image poem draws you in. A gentle, almost folksy narrative voice, setting up images that quietly accumulate power, uh, both from the poet and to the reader, in the reader's mind. Um, so to summarize, concrete imagery is usually depicts nature and everyday life, and then takes surreal jumps that invite subconscious connections, a fusion of outer and inner words, and a plain but intimate voice that grounds the poem's dreaminess and lived experience. It's a bit like being told a bedtime story that slowly turns into a fever dream. You start in a familiar place, then you're carried somewhere deep and strange, without realizing how you got there. And there's no better way of representing that sort of that mentality than a filmmaker, actually, David Lynch. Um, David Foster Wallace wrote a whole poem about Lynchian. And this is why David Lynch is one of the greatest artists of the modern time. I think it's very. I don't know many artists at all who have an entire style named after him. The only one I can think of is Erin Hansen with her modern impressionism. But David Lynch does exactly that, exactly what these poems do. David Lynch does, but except he applies it to film. He takes the most boring, mundane, drudgerous everyday life, trashy cafes, diners, um, drug addicts on the street, and then he mixes it, trailer parks, and then he mixes it with the most disgusting and sinister surrealist nightmares. And those two have no business being around each other. And I think that's a very wonderful analogy that basically the ultimate manifestation of this analogy is David Lynch, but that's put to film. And I'm just showing you the poetic equivalent of this. This is exactly what deep image poetry does in principle. So why are we still talking about deep image poetry in 2025 in a late night lecture, no less? Um, because these poems really pack a strong punch to them. They are poems that cut. They're not poems really that write. Um, the movement may have been relatively short-lived as a trend, and peaking in the '60s and then waning by the late '70s. But the best deep image poems have a timeless ability to move readers, even though people that are often moved by this type of poetry were not even born when they were published. Their secret is how they engage our senses and subconscious directly. When you read a great deep image poem, you often feel a sort of physical response. A chill down someone's spine, a lurch in the stomach. I feel a jolt sometimes, such as in the last line of a particular James Wright poem that I will get to in a minute. Um, before your brain even knows exactly what's happening. It has such an enduring emotional power um, that these poets tapped into by trusting images over explanations. So now for that poem I warned about. A hallmark of the deep image style is the shocking and illuminating climax many of these poems reach. So let's revisit James Wright's Lying in a Ham Hock at William Duffy's farm in Pine Island, Minnesota. All through the poem, Wright shows us a peaceful rural scene: sunlight in the trees, butterflies drifting, even horse droppings glowing like golden stones in the grass. It's all warm, dreamy, and full of that late afternoon hush. And then he ends the poem with a single sentence on its own line, quote unquote, "I have wasted my life." 7 syllables that hit like a thunderclap. For a moment, as readers, we're left reeling, where did that come from? Yet as we sit with it, we realize the images throughout the poem were quickly building that emotion all along. The empty field, the lonely hawk looking for home, the day's end, and it all culminates in an existential unk. And this is the archetypal example of deep image strategy. The images lead us gently to the emotional precipice, and then a final leap, which is that last line, confronts us with the depth of feeling. It's the kind of poetic moment that sticks with you for years. People quote that Wright line endlessly because it encapsulates such a complex flood of regret and longing in a flash. It's visceral, it's ambiguous, and it's beautiful in its sorrow. Um, Galway Kinnell offers a different but equally powerful example. His poem, titled "The Bear," is an intense, almost hallucinatory narrative where the speaker actually tracks a bear through the Arctic, eats the bear's raw liver, so it gets that intense, and in doing so enters a kind of mystical union with the animal. Kinnell doesn't shy away from blood and guts. The imagery is extremely physical. Um, it may not even be for the faint of heart, but the payoff is huge. By the end, the speaker has a transcendental insight. He describes the taste of the bear's blood and calls it, quote unquote, "that poetry by which I lived." It's a pretty astonishing line. He's suggesting that the raw experience symbolized by blood is akin to poetry, and it's been keeping him alive spiritually. Here, the deep image method pushes to an extreme. It finds something sacred in a scene of complete primitive brutality. So it's another example of that artistic uh, conjunctito, that Carl Jung term, artistic marriage of two polar opposites. The emotion evoked is a mix of horror and reverence and awe, and when you read it, you feel like you have undergone something intense and then you reach some euphoria. Uh, so Kinnell has effectively mythologized a very primal experience, and you come away shaken and contemplative. This kind of visceral transcendence is exactly what the deep image poets excelled at delivering. What's remarkable is how these emotional effects last. Readers returning to Bly or Wachowski or Wright today often report that the poems feel as fresh and piercing as ever. There's kind of emotional sustainability in image-driven poetry. Because images don't really age, a vivid picture of a snow-covered field or a dark pine wood can speak to a reader in 2025, just as it did in 1965. And the feelings those images trigger, loneliness, wonder, grief, ecstasy, are pretty timeless as well. It's also worth noting that the deep image poets influenced a broader landscape of poetry in terms of what's allowed in expressing your emotions. By rebelling against the dry intellectualism of the 1950s and the very literal self-disclosure of confessional poetry. So they opened a sort of middle path, impersonal images that paradoxically convey deeply personal emotions. That lesson wasn't lost. You can trace a line from the deep imagists to later poets who used surreal or symbolic imagery to tackle emotional experiences. I can think of someone like Mary Oliver or W.S. Merwin, or even contemporary spoken word artists. They all, in different ways, let images do the emotional heavy lifting. Let them do the hard work. So it's like you're letting the poem do the work rather than the poet. complete trust in that sense. In the end, the deep image movement's enduring legacy is how we appreciate imagery. Um, these people didn't let images decorate the poem, but to be the poem's central theme and central feeling. Um, when all of us encounter a powerful poetic image today that hits us in the heart, uh, we're witnessing a bit of that deep image ethos still at work. This movement might have been relatively brief, but its emotional impact is still reverberating in my mind. Um, and as poetry enthusiasts, we continue to crave that leap a poem can make. That moment when a concrete image suddenly blossoms into an emotional revelation, goddamn, before our eyes. Uh, Deep image poetry perfected that move, that leap. And that's why its best works continue to haunt, inspire, and move people that encounter it, even in the middle of the night, all these years later. And this concludes my lecture on deep image poetry. Here's all the sources that I've used. And I sincerely hope you enjoyed this. And I really hope that I can find the time and the energy to make more history of poetry lectures in the future. And and you can also comment or email me if you want to see more of these. Thank you very much.